Great. Well, hello everybody. Can you hear me? Yep. Good. I'm Damien Carrington. I am the Environment Editor at The Guardian. I'm very pleased that RSA have invited me here to hear this fantastic talk from Sir James Bevan, who's Chief Executive of the Environment Agency. Just before we begin, the usual reminder, please turn your mobiles to silent. We're also filming and live streaming over the web tonight, so hello everyone online. And a reminder, if you want to tweet, there's a hashtag which is #RSA climate, all one word. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to James because we want to have plenty of time to hear his speech, which I've read and it's great, but also to have lots of questions and discussions afterwards. But as some of you will probably know, he joined the Environment Agency as Chief Executive in 2015, and it's no small job, as people who've held that job before have found, looking after the water, the air, the land of this nation. But he's had big jobs before, including being Britain's ambassador to a country of 1 billion people, India, or High Commissioner, as I should probably call it, as well as Chief Operating Officer at the Foreign Office, so kind of running the world in a way, put him in a good position for talking about climate change. I want to make one little mention about the RSA, who are carrying out right now an inquiry to transform our food system and the rural economy and achieve sustainable and accessible countrysides. And if you want to get involved in that, because some of those issues will cross over with what we're talking about this evening, then find out more from the RSA website. So, without further ado, I'll introduce James. He's going to talk for 20 minutes or maybe a little longer, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions until we wrap up around 7, I think. Okay, James.
Well, thanks very much, Damien. I wish you hadn't said it's a fantastic speech, because that's a high bar to hit. But the first thing I want to tell you about this speech is it takes 20 minutes, provided I don't get heckled, which has happened. I'm the father of 3 daughters, and I get heckled even at home. So if I don't get heckled, it's 20 minutes. For those of you who are in a rush and can't wait, I just thought I'd give you the short version of what I'm going to say. 1, climate change is the biggest threat that we face. 2, if we don't tackle it, the consequences are really, really grim. And 3, we can tackle it, and we are tackling it. And the 3 most important things of all that we can do to tackle it are to stop the activities that cause it, to enhance our resilience to its effects, and to talk more about it. So, if you say climate change, it's interesting to see how people react. You're a very informed and committed audience, otherwise you wouldn't be here tonight. But I find that climate change is a bit like sustainable development. It's a phrase which, if you say it, otherwise very well-intentioned people just gently glaze over and start to kind of switch off. So my first kind of plea to you this evening is do not switch off. Climate change is not just words, it is a real thing. And man-made climate change is a very scary real thing. The rise in global temperature over the last several decades is a matter of public record. There is an overwhelming scientific consensus that you can explain that rise only by one thing, which is the rise in greenhouse gas emissions caused by human activities. Now, there are some people in this country, some people in the United States, some quite important people around the world who will tell you that climate change is natural and that we shouldn't worry. And the answer to that is that we have indeed had naturally occurring climate change since our Earth was formed. But none of the natural causes of climate variation, from the sun's output, the tilt of the Earth, volcanic activity, emissions from rotting vegetation, none of those natural causes can account for the warming that we are witnessing today. There is only one single thing that can account for that, and that is the emissions from fossil fuels caused by human activities over the last 200 years. the concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere have increased by nearly 30% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So, first inconvenient truth, climate change is a fact. Second inconvenient truth, not only is global warming happening, but it may actually be speeding up. The 20 warmest years on record have all come since 1995. The 5 warmest years on record have all been in this decade, the 2010s. 2016 was the hottest year since records began. And this year, 2018, we in the UK had the hottest joint summer on record. It was, as you will have noticed, extraordinarily dry too this summer. The driest across England since 1921. This summer, the Environment Agency's hydrologists recorded exceptionally low river flows for 5 weeks in a row, which we have not experienced before. This summer, soils in the northwest were the driest on record. This summer, reservoir stocks were at historic lows. And only a couple of months ago, I was in Haweswater, which some of you may know, up in the beautiful Lake District. Huge reservoir built by the Victorians to feed Manchester. It's almost empty. At least it was when I looked at it. And it was so low that you can see the village that was flooded a century ago to create that reservoir. That's quite a scary picture. We've also had damage to the environment this summer. Numerous species, habitats, birds, trees, aquatic life have all been affected by the hot conditions and the high demand for water. We, in the Environment Agency, we were required as a result of that to respond to a more than 3-fold increase in the number of environmental incidents that we react to. And we had teams out there day in, day out to seek to protect wildlife and to seek to rescue hundreds of fish, thousands of fish, struggling due to low river flows and low oxygen. Now, this kind of thing won't happen every year, but ladies and gentlemen, I am here to tell you that it will happen more frequently, and it will happen worse. Now, I think most of us probably enjoyed this summer's exceptional weather, but by 2040, it is likely that there won't be anything exceptional about summers like the one that we've just had. The records will keep on tumbling, and the exceptional may become the new normal. Now, just as the rate of temperature rise looks to be accelerating, so too does one of its main and most scary consequences, the rise in sea level. So over the last 20 years, sea levels have risen at roughly twice the speed of the preceding 80 years. It gets worse. While the international community has pledged, as most of you know, to avoid a rise of more than 2 degrees centigrade in the average of global temperature by 2100, compared with pre-industrial levels, many scientists now think that the figure will be higher. The central scientific estimate, if you take the averages, is that by 2100, global temperature will have risen by nearly twice the 2-degree figure, by around 3.5 degrees centigrade. Next big point, and one that bears constant repetition: if we don't tackle climate change, then very, very bad things will happen. Global warming, it's another one of those kind of deceptive phrases. Doesn't sound that threatening if you live in a chilly island off the northwest coast of Europe like we do. You might think that a few more degrees of temperature would be a rather good thing to have. But it's a misleading and invidious phrase, global warming, because it doesn't identify what will actually happen as the globe warms. So let me do that. What will happen is that the tropics will be hotter and drier. The higher latitudes of our planet, where we, the UK, sit, will be hotter and wetter. In Britain, the result will be that we will have hotter summers, and by 2040, we expect that half of our summers will exceed temperatures of 2003. We'll have wetter winters. We'll have extreme rainfall events which become more extreme. That is already happening. My first week as Chief Executive of the Environment Agency coincided with Storm Desmond in December 2015. In 2015 Storm Desmond, a gauge at the Honister Pass in Cumbria, recorded 341 millimetres of rain in 24 hours, so more than a foot of rain in 24 hours. That was a new record, and that rain caused some of the worst flooding in Cumbria in living memory. Last year's flash floods at the Cornish coastal village of Coverack. You may have seen scary TV footage of a wall of water thundering down a high street, over a wall and into the sea. Those flash floods were caused by an extreme rainfall event, which also set a new UK record, this time for a 3-hour rainfall intensity. We were lucky, the people of Coverack were lucky, because half a mile offshore that day, the rainfall intensity was 20% higher. And we were very lucky that that amount of rainfall did not make landfall. The other thing that will happen with global warming, of course, is that sea levels will rise, perhaps by up to a metre or more in places by 2100, as the waters warm and take up more space, and as our glaciers and land-based ice sheets start to melt. Now, I said sea level rise was scary. It's particularly scary to me because it's not like other climate change-driven effects. So extreme flooding, extreme drought, those can have very, very serious consequences, but they're basically recoverable from. But there is no recovery from a rising sea because it takes land, it takes communities, it takes infrastructure, and it takes everything else away, and it takes it away forever. So all these changes in climate will have consequences. They will mean a bunch of bad stuff. They will mean more and more frequent flooding and coastal erosion caused by those wetter winters, heavier rain, more violent storms. That threatens all of us. I've seen what happens when floods happen to people. They destroy lives, they destroy livelihoods, they destroy communities. There will be more of them unless we deal with this issue. We'll see more water shortages, as we nearly had this summer, and higher drought risk caused by hotter, drier summers and less predictable rainfall. That could do huge damage to our economy as well as our environment. We'll see more frequent and more extreme fires and wildfires, as we saw in Britain and in Europe and around the world this summer. We'll see more air and water pollution due to those longer, hotter summers. We'll see more damage to wildlife and the habitat on which it depends. In many cases, that damage may be existential. So another scary statistic is that if we continue to emit greenhouse gases at the same rate as today, then by 2050, which many of us in this room can hope to live to see, 1 million species around the globe will have vanished. Now, we in this country, Britain, are particularly exposed to most of these effects. That's because we sit at a weather crossroads. We've got a big water mass to the west, a large land mass to the south, and the jet stream runs over the top. And that location means that we will experience in this country more of this extreme weather than some others. So if anybody in the room is comfortable, or was at the start, please don't get comfortable. Please don't be comfortable, because if we allow climate change to continue unchecked, then England's green and pleasant land, it won't be green, it won't be pleasant, and there won't be that much land left. Example, Lincolnshire. Many of us know Lincolnshire, beautiful county, flat, low-lying, quite a lot of its tidal floodplain. Well, it's already at significant flood risk. 43 people died in the Great East Coast storm surge in 1953 in Lincolnshire, when a huge tidal surge overwhelmed the coastal defences and came inland. We have spent, in the Environment Agency, hundreds of millions of pounds over the last 20, 30 years mitigating that risk to Lincolnshire, maintaining the sea walls, building new defences, and it's worked. In 2013, there was an even bigger East Coast storm surge than happened in 1953. Nobody died. But as the sea levels rise and the storms get fiercer, you have to ask how much higher you can carry on building the walls around our coasts. There's a limit to what is practical, there's a limit to what is affordable. And even if we do build higher defences around the coastline, there's a problem with our rivers, which is this. Climate change means you're going to get more rain falling more quickly into rivers, so they will fill up more quickly. They will flood the surrounding land unless they can rapidly discharge all that extra rainwater into the sea. But higher tides, higher levels of sea mean that precisely when we need our rivers to be better able to discharge that water, they're going to be less able to do so because they'll be tidelocked. So you could look at 3 different nightmare scenarios. One where you have high seas, overwhelming flood defence. A second, where the rivers just flood the land behind the defences. And a third, where those two things happen simultaneously. So, result. If we don't mitigate these risks, many low-lying parts of the country, not just Lincolnshire, will be either permanently waterlogged or flooded with such frequency as to be no longer habitable. Now, just to bring that back to Lincolnshire, that would mean Skegness would no longer exist. Lincoln would sit on the edge of a new wet fenland landscape, and much of the rest of that county would revert to marsh. Now, I'm not exaggerating. I might even be underplaying it a bit. You may have read something in the summer about a study by an international team of climate researchers who warned of a hothouse Earth scenario, where without intervention we cross a threshold which leads to runaway climate change, with sea level rise of up to 60 metres. Now, 60 metres sea level rise would not just make Lincolnshire history, it wouldn't just make Britain history, but it would essentially make most of the Earth uninhabitable. So, that is why climate change is the biggest issue there is. It is simply the biggest threat out there to our economy, our environment, our way of life, our country, our world, and our future. So much for the bad news. I also have good news. The good news is it doesn't have to be like that. We can tackle this problem if we act now. There are, of course, some effects of climate change which will continue for the next 30 to 40 years now, whatever we do. But the key point is, if we act now, we can affect what happens after that. We know what we need to do. It's summed up by another two words that tend to make people switch off but are important. Mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is about addressing the causes of climate change by reducing or stopping the human activities that affect the climate system. Example, by cutting emissions of greenhouse gases. And most of our emissions in this country come from the way that we produce and consume energy. Heating buildings, driving cars, manufacturing goods, watching TVs, watching me on the internet at home, boiling kettles. We can lower our emissions by becoming more energy efficient and moving to renewable or low carbon fuels. I think as a country we've made a good start on that. UK emissions are down 43% compared to 1990, while over the same period the economy has grown significantly. That's really important because I think we have to be able to demonstrate to our public that we can both tackle climate change and carbon on the one hand and deliver sustainable growth and prosperity on the other. Adaptation, the other bit of this, is making changes that will prepare us for or reduce or negate the effects of climate change. Example, building stronger or smarter sea defences. Other things we could be doing and should be doing include reducing water usage by cutting leakage, avoiding any unnecessary development on floodplains, and designing infrastructure that is built to be resilient to the extreme weather that we know we're going to be facing. That's the first bit of good news. We can deal with this. Second bit of good news, I think, and this room may represent it, that there's emerging a pretty broad consensus, at least in this country, about the need to do these things. I think the government gets it. If you read the 25-year environment plan that was launched by the Prime Minister in January with Michael Gove, that commits the government to take all possible action to mitigate climate change. You can see it in the National Adaptation Programme, which DEFRA issued this summer, which sets out the actions the government is going to take over the next 5 years to help us adapt to climate change. And you can see it in the government's new National Planning Policy Framework, which is explicit that all new development should take a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting for climate change. So I think the government gets it. I think the independent experts, there are many in this room, get it. The National Infrastructure Commission has recommended a national standard of flood protection for every community to be achieved by 2050 to guard against the effects of climate change, a concept that we support. The Green Finance Task Force, which many of you will know about, leading experts from finance, from academia, from civil society, has identified ways in which you can shift capital and encourage capital to move towards greener and cleaner sectors in the UK, and rightly is framing this not as a cost, but as a huge opportunity for finance. I think business increasingly gets it. Many people from the business community here tonight. The insurance companies are pricing climate change into their policies. The water companies, the energy companies, retail companies, they see the business sense, the hard-nosed business sense, in investing now for resilience later. because every single business needs to know that when the extremes of climate change happen, that they can sustain their operations, or if they can't sustain them, that they'll be the first back up and running after the effects hit. I think the NGOs get it. There are many people representing NGOs in the room tonight. I think many of those NGOs, not just the environmental NGOs, recognise now that whatever it is that they want to achieve, they can't achieve it without tackling the issue of climate change. And I hope you will agree that the Environment Agency gets it too. We're a regulator. It's one of the things we do. We work day in, day out with industry to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They're down by nearly 40% since 2000 on the industries that we regulate. We work with local authorities, with planners, with developers to create better places that are designed for the climate that I've sketched out we anticipate. And we're working with the water companies to craft better, more sustainable, more resilient arrangements for provision of water in this country over the next 50 years. We're building new flood defences up and down the country that are explicitly designed for climate change. We're thinking long term about those defences. We design them with the latest climate change predictions in mind. We even build extra strong foundations under many of them so that we can raise them as sea level and river flows rise. And despite the long design lives of those bits of infrastructure, we're already working on replacements for many of them. Example, the Thames Barrier, which is quietly protecting us here this evening, which protects millions of other people, £200 billion worth of assets. That is designed specifically to sustain that level of protection until at least 2070, and it will. Or if it doesn't, I don't have a job, but it will. And we're already planning its successor. And I like to think of those projects. This is a project that I won't live to see fruition, but I like to think of that and those other projects that we're engaged in as a bit like the kind of great age of cathedral building. There's one generation that will develop the plans and lay the foundations, and we're part of that. But another generation will actually lift the spire. Our philosophy in the Environment Agency is we shouldn't be aiming just to kind of survive in this rather challenging world. We should be aiming to thrive, for all of us to thrive. And I think we can do that if we work with the grain of nature. One example, Medmurray flood defence scheme on the Sussex coast, worth visiting. Instead of building an unsightly wall between the sea and the local community to protect them, we did something rather counterintuitive, which was to knock a large hole in the coastline to let the sea in behind the line of the coast, so as to create a large new area of coastal wetland. And that wetland, the wetland, is the flood defence. It's the flood defence because it absorbs high tides safely, but it's also a new and beautiful wildlife habitat run by the RSPB as a bird sanctuary, and it's a great example of how, with a bit of imagination, you can turn the threat of climate change into a fantastic opportunity to create a better place. We're also trying to walk the walk ourselves. Very important that organisations kind of live their values. We're trying to reduce our own carbon footprint in terms of our operations, day in, day out. We are investing our own pension fund aggressively in green finance. We're a leader in that. And together with the Church of England, we've founded the Transition Pathway Initiative, which has got the Paris climate goals at its heart and which assesses how companies are preparing for the transition to a low-carbon economy, and is supported by asset managers and owners with over £7 trillion worth of assets under management. And at the Global Climate Action Summit hosted by Governor Brown in the US only a few days ago, it was announced that the Transition Pathways Initiative will inform something called Climate Action 100+, which is a global investor initiative supported by $31 trillion assets under management to engage with companies to drive climate action. Most important of all, and the reason that I am, despite all the bad news, an optimist, I think it's not just the government, it's not just business, it's not just the Environment Agency, it's not just the NGOs who get it. I think that our public are increasingly getting it. More and more of the people that I meet up and down the country tell me that they see evidence of climate change in their own daily experience. Most of them go on to say that they recognise that this is a problem not just for the Environment Agency or the government, but for all of us, and that we all have a responsibility to deal with it together. And I really don't think that you should ever underestimate the power of the people. We've seen an almost overnight change in popular behaviour in relation to plastics. We're seeing something similar, if slower, in relation to people's attitude to water. It's become socially unacceptable to litter or to use throwaway plastic bags. It is increasingly socially unacceptable to waste water. And I think the same thing can happen, and maybe it already is happening, with regard to behaviour which stokes climate change. Final bit of good news before I wrap up. It will cost a lot of money to respond successfully to climate change, but we can afford it. Indeed, it's the best investment we could possibly make. It would actually be much more expensive not to respond, and the economic benefits of mitigating and adapting to climate change in terms of damage forgone, but also in terms of extra growth achieved through new investment, new infrastructure, prosperity boosted through innovation, those benefits greatly outweigh any costs of the investment that we need to put in. So let me wrap up this way. There is a scandal about climate change, but the scandal about climate change is not that it's made up. The scandal is that it's not made up, and that while a lot is already being done to tackle it, we're still not doing everything that we could. Now, why is that? Why is climate change not at the top of every single person's agenda in this country and around the world? Well, partly, no doubt, because lots of people have busy lives and they've got other things to worry about. Partly, I suspect, because most of the effects of climate change tend to be invisible and incremental until they are suddenly catastrophic. So it's easy for most people to kind of just park it as a problem. But I also think one of the reasons why this isn't right at the top of everyone's agenda is to do with language. And I think what we say and how we say it does matter. So here's a final thought. If words like climate change, if words like global warming have become a turn-off for most ordinary people, then maybe we should change the words. Maybe we should talk instead about what those things mean. They mean killer weather. They mean a world underwater, and they mean a mortgaged future. Now, the fact that you're all here tonight tells me that all of you kind of know most of this, and all of you are already committed to do what you can with us to tackle this challenge. But I have to say, I don't think most people, most ordinary people, necessarily would get out of bed to fight something that sounds vaguely technical and not really very threatening, that you call climate change. But I do think pretty much everybody, not just all the people in this room, will get out of bed to protect their loved ones, to protect our homes, and to protect our livelihoods, and to build a better world. And that's what it's ultimately about. So, conclusion, climate change is too true to be good. Let's tell it like it is. Let's tackle it together. Let's redouble our efforts. Final thought. Over the last 200 years, humans have comprehensively demonstrated that they can change the climate, and we have changed it for the worse by doing the wrong things. Now let's show we can change it for the better by doing the right things. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, James. I told you it was good. We're going to have some questions, and there are microphones around, so I will take those in a minute. I'm just going to ask one or two of my own, but I do want lots of questions from you guys too. The first thing I was going to ask about was about speed of action. I think you set out a whole bunch of things really fantastically clearly and well. But a lot of people, a lot of scientists, for example, that I talk to, in my work, think that, the speed is just not there. So, for example, there are a lot of people who think we've got to peak global emissions by 2020. That's quite close. And that takes a lot of things to happen. And just as an example, you say you think government gets it, and I think they do in a kind of broad sense, but kind of specifically when you start drilling down to what that means, like in your world's sustainable drainage systems, or the Climate Change Committee was warning about how unprepared schools, hospitals, care homes are for extreme heat. I'm wondering, how do we kind of try and speed things up? What would you say to that?
I would say that you're right that we would want to see greater speed than we have seen across the whole of the international community. But I'm also conscious of, there's some very wise advice given by Arthur Ashe, famous tennis player, which is start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. So we're starting where we are, we need to use what we have, and we need to do what we can. I think in a way, whilst you can run the argument that the international community has been slow to respond, given the complexities of getting any international action on any issue, and my hinterland, as you know, is diplomacy, in a way I'm impressed that there is such a consensus internationally, and that across the globe a lot of action is being taken. How do we get it going even faster? I think we have to talk about it. I think we do have to kind of grab people by lapels and say, this is really, really important. But I also think if we're talking about global progress, and I say this from my experience in India with, as you said, a fifth of the world's population, what we cannot do is have that debate by positing a choice between, on the one hand, tackling climate change, and on the other, growth. You can't tell 1.2 billion Indians or 1.3 billion Chinese that they can't have the growth and the prosperity and the jobs and all the things that we've enjoyed in the West unless they tackle. You've got to say you can do both of those things. If we can find a way to demonstrate that we can simultaneously bear down on carbon, increase resilience, and drive growth, that's a really winning formula. And as I said, I think we can do that.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll come to you guys. So do get thinking of the questions and ready to put your hands up, please. It's sort of related to the first one. I sort of just thought you have a very interesting experience at the Environment Agency because you're simultaneously doing two things, one of which is, planning for 2100 with the Thames Barrier, as you say, I won't see it, you won't see it. Which, no. So it's a very long term, and simultaneously, as you found out 2 weeks into your job, you can be kind of on the front page of the newspapers every day dealing with what essentially is a national emergency, and so you've got those kind of two speeds. And I wonder, one of my colleagues is a wise old soul once told me that the reason climate change often didn't get to the top of Whitehall's agenda or the political agenda was that governments can only think about 2 or 3 things at any one time. Obviously there's one big thing going on right now, which is occupying a lot of attention. But I'm just wondering, in your experience, having done the very short term, the very long term, how do you get attention, in let's say in government circles?
So I think you're right, and the challenge for all of us, whatever we do, is to distinguish between the important and the urgent, and try and do both of those simultaneously. I think there is, in some ways, a benign relationship between the short-term life that I have dealing with drought and flood, and the long-term challenges of climate change. Because as I said in my speech, actually they're directly linked, and people are increasingly making the link. So, my first week as chief executive, big floods in Cumbria, a lot of people said to me, voluntarily, this is climate change, isn't it? Now, whether or not it was or wasn't, that's what people are starting to think. And we've had the same kind of conversations this summer as we got closer and closer to water restrictions. So I think the fact that people in their lived experience are seeing short-term effects is actually helping generate pressure for long-term action. How do you get government's attention? Well, basically, in democracies, you've got to wind people up. Politicians, and I've worked with a lot of them, I've got a lot of respect for politicians. I think they get a bad rap, but they will respond to public demand. And the more that ordinary people around the world demand of their politicians action on climate change, the more that will happen.
Great. Okay, good. I can see some hands going up already. Do we have microphones? We do, yeah, I see them waving. Great. We'll start with this lady here with the grey jumper. And we might take a couple, actually. There's a gentleman at the back as well with his hand up. He can go second. Yeah, let's take 2 together. So if you can say where you're from and who you are, that'd be great.
My name's Linda Seward. I'm a fellow, and I work, I'm afraid, on brands and advertising. This is probably not the ideal first question because you've been talking about the UK, but you did touch on the fact that international collaboration is really important and how difficult it is. There have been stories coming out of China about how they are tackling climate change. To what extent is this true or significant, do you think?
Good question. Let's take the second question as well, and we'll sort of take them together. So, gentleman just at the back there. Yeah?
Hi, Sir James. Thanks very much for your talk. Yeah, you're right. We do need to look at all the problems that we might have not looked at and all the possible solutions as well. With that in mind, I would like to ask, just like you've got 200 scientists around the world actually saying we've got a massive push behind 5G into technology everywhere. And they're actually saying the huge amount of radiation from the cells, from the monitors, from the smart meters, we need to have a moratorium on that.
All right, I'm not sure that's directly related to what we're talking about.
It is
Tell me how, briefly, otherwise I'll move on.
Because the huge amount of radiation, the amount of heat, and also connected to India, as Sir James was saying, where do all these cells and receptors and minerals come from?
All right. Okay.
So
Let's
they have
take
to
one
be
more.
dug up
Let's
from
take one
somewhere.
more.
Thank you.
And there's a gentleman at the back who was quite, pink shirt. I can't quite see. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Donica McCarthy, Climate Media Coalition. You portrayed a nightmare scenario, and then you went on and said government, business, and the community gets it. I actually disagree with that. Our government in the last few years has given £46 billion tax cut to the fossil fuel industry via the diesel and petrol levy. It's given permission for Heathrow. It's trashed the solar industry. It's trashed the onshore wind industry. It's ramming through fracking. In fact, the entire agenda of the government in the last 5 years has been the opposite direction of taking action at the level of seriousness facing us. So I would really, the failure, I think, in your presentation is you outlined a nightmare, you said everybody's taking action, and then you didn't outline anything that we need to urgently do.
Okay, that's a good challenge. Right, so let's take them. There was the question, is China really acting, and what are they doing there? Question, I guess we could talk about information technology and the expanding energy use and materials that were coming from that. And then finally this challenge that actually the government hasn't got a clue with Heathrow, fracking, solar, wind.
Okay. All right. China. So I don't know it very well, but I have visited China and talked to people there. What's striking to me about China, it gets back to the point we were making about how you get action. You get action through pressure on governments to do things. And although China is not, of course, a democracy in any sense that we would understand it, I was very struck by how powerful the pressure was on the party and the government in China to take action on climate change and broader environmental issues, because that is the number one issue for many young Chinese, because they see it in their towns and cities and their rural villages. So again, I'm encouraged that whatever the politics are, if enough people are demanding action and are seeing deleterious effects on the ground, action will be taken. And I think the Chinese government is now having to respond. And I don't want to compare any particular countries out there, but the Chinese, compared with some other large countries, couldn't possibly comment, are solid supporters of the Paris Accords, and that's a really, really good and important thing. I don't know enough about the technology question to give you a serious answer about the detail, but I do know that you're right that we need to make technology part of the solution. And again, I am confident that with the right innovation, we ought to be able to design a lot of technological solutions that will help us deal with the issues that I've been talking about. Does the government get it? I mean, there are people in the audience who represent the government directly who may want to tell you different. I think that governments get it. This is not a political point. I've worked in my life for a whole bunch of different British governments. What's one example of that? The Climate Change Act, which has, it was introduced under Labour, but it has cross-party support. It's been adhered to and taken forward by the present government. Is any government doing enough? We can debate that. But I think we have to recognise that all governments have to balance the two issues that I was describing. On the one hand, they have to have regard to protecting the environment and tackling climate change. On the other, they have to ensure growth, prosperity, all the things that the voters want. And when you're a politician, it's always difficult to get that balance exactly right. But do I think governments get it? Do I think governments are trying within the political constraints that they have to tackle this issue? Yes, I do, and I've thought that of every single government that I've worked for.
Let me just sort of add on to that, because I think it's an interesting point. So, in a way, a government could get it in a long-term way. They could say, we have the Climate Change Act, which sets out various things for the future. But when push comes to shove on individual decisions, like Heathrow, or subsidies for the solar industry, or for fracking, or for these other things. I mean, in your time, as you say, working for all different governments of different persuasions, do you think more of those short-term decisions are starting to take in that longer-term interest for climate change? Do you see any kind of change in that?
I I think it's become part of the narrative. I think all governments will fairly soon, when they start talking about what their policy agenda is, they will fairly soon get onto climate change. I think that's different from what it was 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. And I also think that successive governments have made some of these difficult arbitrations between, on the one hand, growth and on the other, protecting the environment and tackling climate change. Example, the regulation of industries that the Environment Agency is responsible for. We are, because of different governments' decisions, we are increasingly bearing down on the ability of industry across this country to emit greenhouse gases. Now, that's a choice made by a series of governments to put in place regulation or laws that deliberately drives down those emissions. That's the right choice, in my view, and it has driven innovation. But it's not neutral. It's a political decision to take you in the right direction. Okay,
let's get some more questions. So I'm going to come right down to the front here. And let's see. Oh, we've got lots of questions. That's great. I'm going to take this one here and take the woman there with glasses on your head. Sorry about that. And we'll take one more. Where should we go? There's another woman here with spectacles. So can we do those in those three order, please? Yeah.
Just bring things home. I live about 5 miles away from Honister Pass. I saw a lot of rainfall in that period. My work is with the Woodland Trust. We've planted about 1.5 million trees in Cumbria in the last 8 years. Working in natural flood management has proven to be very difficult. It's very bruising. We need some really dedicated pressure from government to actually change people's mindsets about natural flood management. And from your perspective, the EA, we also need to get beyond this cost-benefit analysis when we kind of look at trees in the environment. They really do work, but we can't get past your bean counters in terms of getting funding out of you to actually plant more. And we really need to do that, and we need to get your guidance and support on that.
All right, thank you. Where are we going? We're going to the lady over here. Yeah. And then, sorry, the lady in the middle. Do you want to put your hand up so the mic can come to you? But yeah, fire away.
Thank you. Amanda Nobbs, I'm a fellow. Your warning coincides with a time when we need to be providing a lot more homes in this country. Are we doing enough to shift where those homes are being built and the way in which we're designing those homes and our existing homes? And if not, what more should we be doing?
Great question. And the last one for now.
Hello?
Yes,
my name's Cass Breen and I'm a fellow too. Thank you very much for your assessment, which was rather bleak, but on the good side, I suppose it makes Brexit look like a mere bagatelle. What I wanted to ask you about was agriculture, farming and food production, and whether there are any predictions or assessments about that you would like to comment on.
Great. So some home territory questions there. Natural flood management. Why won't the bean counters pass it? New homes, are they being built in the right places, in the right standards? And then agriculture, what's the sort of prospects for that? When you come to agriculture, I'm quite interested in terms of the also the regulation of emissions from agriculture, because that's one of the sectors that's quite hard to tackle, along with transport and heating. Electricity going fantastically well. The rest of them, not so much. But off you go.
Okay, trees. I'm a big fan. There's almost nothing that you need to solve that a tree won't help you with. In terms of planting trees for improving not just as carbon sinks, which is one obvious use of them, but improving water quality, shade for cattle, beauty, wildlife habitat. So, tree is the answer to many important questions, and natural flood management using trees as part of that is a coming thing. You're right about that. We already try to design natural flood management into each one of our flood schemes, so we will always ask what could we do through natural measures as well as concrete or anything else. And the Medmary scheme that I referred to is, I think, a good example of natural flood management. The government gets it. The government's made commitments to bring forward, has just announced a few months ago, a fund, initially £10 million for people to bid into for natural flood management. We will run that, so if you haven't already bid, look out for it. Okay, all right. Right, I didn't bring my checkbook, but we buy the concept and it will be resourced, and it is a very smart...
Do you think it will grow? Because £10 million is a lot of money, but in terms of the EA's budget for flood defences, it's quite small.
In a way, it's misleading because we have a £2.6 billion budget for flood defence over the 6-year period that we're building around the country, and a lot of that money, in one way or another, is going into schemes which you could rightly classify as natural flood management. So a much greater total than 10 million is going into natural flood management in this country.
Including trees?
Including trees,
Okay.
yeah.
New homes?
Homes. I mean, this gets to my point about balancing, trying not to have to choose between the environment and mitigating climate change on the one hand and growth and development on the other. I'm not convinced, I think it's behind your question, that every new home is going in the right place. I do a lot of travelling around the country. In particular, we're still seeing some building in floodplains. That shouldn't be happening unless there's a really, really strong reason. One reason I'm more upbeat than I might have been a year ago, and this again may get to the questioner who argue that the government doesn't really get it, is this new concept of net gain. So one of the things that's come out of the 25-year environment plan that the government launched this year, reinforced in the new planning guidelines, talks about the importance of environmental net gain, i.e. Future developments need to not just be neutral, certainly not damaging in terms of the environment, they need to contribute a net gain, either to habitat or some other environmental benefit. I think that's a good thing and shows government, again, I think, making some difficult choices. Should homes be designed to be resilient? Absolutely. I think we can learn a lot from other countries. I mean, Netherlands, for example, they have homes that will literally float if the floodwaters get too high. Should they be more resource efficient and carbon neutral? Absolutely. And I think, again, there are potential business benefits and attractions for developers who can come up with ways of doing that will be attractive.
Do you think there needs to be a bit more regulation? Does the EA need to have a bit more power? Because, the zero carbon homes got thrown out, SUDS as a bit more sustainable drainage schemes hasn't been made, kind of...
I think the planning thing is a really good example of where you need to be careful not to reach immediately for very top-down central state directive solutions, because you also want local democracy, you want local people to take ownership of the choices they have to make about what houses go where. And because the right answer in one place may not be the right answer somewhere else. So actually, some regulators might want more power. I'm not in this area looking for it.
Agriculture?
Agriculture. I think, again, if we don't mitigate climate change in the ways that I've talked about and adapt, then you have to ask whether there is a future for agriculture in the world, because you clearly can't run the kind of agriculture that the world is running if most of your land is underwater. I mean, getting back to Lincolnshire, my Lincolnshire example, if that scenario were to come true, you wouldn't be able to farm in Lincolnshire, and Lincolnshire generates quite a lot of the fruit and vegetables that we consume in this country. Good news, though, I think if we get it right, we can sustain agriculture around the world. If we get Brexit right, and I'm glad that it's taken 45 minutes before I've said the B word. If we get Brexit right, there are opportunities to make it better. So, Michael Gove's policy is to rewrite agricultural policy in this country, to take us away from the common agricultural policy, which I think we can all agree, if we think about Brexit, has had a series of very negative effects for the environment as well as for agriculture. So I do think there are opportunities in the Brexit space to design a better agriculture for this country, which is more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, and will give farmers a decent return.
Just a quick word on what the EA might be doing around emissions, like greenhouse gas emissions from farms, ammonia emissions as well, which contribute to air pollution.
So you're right, ammonia is a big issue, and indeed farming is a big issue in terms of pollution generally. So farming now contributes a higher total of serious pollution incidents in this country than any other sector. Now we need, as regulators, again, we need to regulate farming in a way that doesn't stop farmers from farming, because we need the food and prosperity that they generate, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't damage the environment. That's why the bits of farming that do produce the highest emissions of ammonia, which are intensive forms of farming, intensive pig farming, intensive poultry farming, those are very tightly regulated by the Environment Agency. And as we move out of the European Union, we will want to look at whether and if so how we should strengthen the way in which we regulate those emissions.
Okay, great. We've got time for some more questions. I've sort of ignored these people a bit. So going to go for gentleman there. Yeah, sorry, can I just line up a couple of others as well? This gentleman right over at the back with his hand up there. Yeah, sort of in camouflage, although I can still see you. And we'll go over here. We'll take this gentleman who's been very patient. Thank you. Sorry.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't... sorry, go ahead. I didn't have you in mind, but we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Go on.
My name is David Cotton. I've written a couple of books about climate change. Your last comments there raised the question of we could cut out a lot of greenhouse gases if we all became vegan. And what do you think about that?
Excellent. Right, yeah. We haven't got too long, so try and keep it brief. Yep.
Not trying to be in camouflage, but closely associated with the Church of England, which sometimes disappears from sight. Thank you very much for your succinct contribution. By your own admission, you have a hinterland of diplomacy, but you did squeak in that you would like to wind up some politicians. I would like to invite you, at risk of your own position, to say categorically, and not in diplomatic language, why Brexit is going to be a good thing for climate change.
Okay, good question. And this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Charlie Payton from Seawater Greenhouse, but I was heartened to hear that you're a fan of forests, but I manage an area of woodland in the south of England which suffered badly from landslip after this wettest winter on record. And we repaired it using, in part, local material from building sites, soil, rock, excavations and stuff. And we've been commended on the work we've done by the Environment Agency, but told that everything we've done is illegal, because anything coming out of a building site is waste and has to be taxed and go to landfill. I'd appreciate your comments.
Okay. Great. I'm going to take one last one because we're going to run out of time otherwise, and I did promise this gentleman. Yeah.
Group. You made the point that the UK managed to cut its emissions by just over 40% since 1990, which is an important achievement. But when you look at it, we've done that by and large without actually having to engage people directly. It's mainly been done through cleaning up the power system, a bit more efficiency in industry. Going forward, over the next 10 to 20 years, if we're going to reach our climate targets, the changes we're looking at are people insulating their homes much better than they have to date, people eating less meat, society flying less. Now, in other words, government policy is going to have to get much closer to people's everyday life. Now, in your speech, you made the important point around the importance of communication. You know, we need to communicate with people in order to take them on board the climate agenda and increase climate action. How do you suggest best taking on that communication challenge?
Good. Actually, James, don't mind. Take that last one first, because I know that at the Environment Agency you've had to put a lot of thought into communication, because you have obviously a big role in trying to not only warn people of imminent flooding, but also trying to get them to prepare, you know, whether it's preparing their homes, getting resilience in place. So what about how do you communicate when things get quite close to people?
I think the best form of communication is what we're doing now, face-to-face. I mean, it's great that we're online, and it's fantastic that in the 21st century you can communicate, you know, if you like, remotely. But if you actually want to, I mean, my experience, and this goes back to my kind of hinterland as a diplomat, if you actually want to change people's minds, you have to have a conversation face-to-face. So I guess the first point is, you know, information is easy to push out, but that doesn't necessarily change anything. What changes stuff is face-to-face conversations where real people talk about the real effects on their own lives of whatever it is that you want to influence. And that is a very resource-intensive exercise. So if we are going to, if you like, win, which I don't think we have yet won, the communication battle, to get, as you said rightly, essentially everybody to change their lifestyle, all of us are going to have to play a role. The Environment Agency can play a part, the government can play a part, but every single one of you and all the organisations that you represent and every other organisation that cares about this needs to be engaged. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a kind of decade-long project. But I do think it can happen because we have seen radical changes in personal behaviour. You know, whether you think about how people, you know, treat women compared to how it was 25 years ago, that's better. Not perfect, but it's a lot different from what it was when I was a young person. Nobody would think of coming in here and lighting a cigarette. 25 years ago, there had been a smoke haze in this room. I mentioned the plastics example. So I do think that personal behaviour is the key. I do think it can be changed, but I do think it requires all of us to have those conversations.
Okay, I think the first question there was talking about behaviour change. It was basically, are you a vegan?
Okay, so I am not a vegan, but I have 3 daughters, one of whom is a vegan, one of whom is a vegetarian, one of whom is a meat eater. So I guess that's sort of good demographic representation of, and as I said at the start, you know, I get lots of attitude from all of them about why I'm wrong on whatever my approach is. I think more seriously, I do think, as somebody said, we need to eat less meat. You know, I think that's pretty much unarguable. I don't personally think that we need to move the whole world to veganism in order to tackle the challenges that I've talked about. I don't think it's necessary if we are smart about the way that we farm and if we put in place the other measures that I've talked about. I also doubt whether it is possible, given what I know about cultures around the world, some of whom are very attached to eating meat. I also think that there would be, if we did achieve, let's say we got everybody in the UK to be vegan, I think there will be some potentially unintended consequences for the environment. So, you know, I spent a day last month with various dairy farmers, who we also regulate. One thing that came home to me quite strongly, not just how much they care about their animals and the welfare of their animals, but the consequences of dairy farming. There are some benign environmental consequences. Grass. You know, I'm a tree fan. I'm also a grass fan. There's a lot of grass covering this country. A lot of the reason for that grass is because dairy farmers and beef farmers need it. And if you took away, you know, livestock farming, you might end up taking away most of the grass. And that would have some fairly significant consequences, could have significant consequences for the environment. So I admire people who make those lifestyle choices about veganism, vegetarianism. I don't think we need to do that in order to achieve our goals.
Okay, I'm leaving the Brexit one till last, but
Okay.
there was another question about whether you can use this kind of building waste in a way that you wanted to. I wasn't sure exactly what it was. But.
Yeah, I mean, send us the details and we'll look at the issue. Clearly, as a regulator, we need to make sure that, if you like, potentially or actually hazardous waste being removed from you know, commercial sites is dealt with properly, because there are big environmental consequences of that. But we're not dumb. We don't want to get in the way of charities or NGOs or other enterprises that are doing benign things for the environment by insisting on a specific measure that is more designed for major commercial companies. So I'm not making a promise to give you a blank check, but if you get in touch with us and let us know what the issue is, and we'll make you a promise that we'll look at it, and we'll look at it pragmatically.
Boss is now aware. Right. Okay. Very good. Right, so Brexit. So why could that be a good thing?
Okay.
Take it from the Environment Agency's point of view.
Why could it be a good thing? So health warning, you're talking to somebody who used to work for the Foreign Office, who spent 20 years of his life designing, or working with other colleagues to design a European Union that was tuned, we thought, at the time, for Britain. So to design a European Union that had all the stuff that Britain wanted, a single market, open, outward-looking approach to the world, strong security guarantees, brought in the Eastern Europeans, spoke English, didn't smoke, all the things that we thought we wanted, and we kind of achieved that. So you need to aim off when I tell you why Brexit can be a brilliant thing for the environment. I think it can. I think whatever we think about Brexit, if it's going to happen, then the sensible thing is to seek to exploit and use all the opportunities that exist and to moderate down the risks. And I do think there are opportunities in the environmental space. What are they? I'll give you 2 examples. One we've mentioned, agriculture. The Common Agricultural Policy has been bad for pretty much everything. It's a one-size-fits-all policy that at the moment rewards people just for owning land. It's a one-size-fits-all policy that couldn't possibly be finely tuned for the UK's needs because it's also tuned for Greece's needs and you know, Sweden's needs. So designing a new agricultural policy as we leave the European Union, I really do think is a fantastic opportunity for better environmental outcomes, better mitigations of climate change, and I do think more sustainable farming, and we're working very closely with Michael Gove, DEFRA and others to try and design that policy. Second example, EU environmental regulation. A lot of it's very good, largely because we wrote it. I mean, a lot of EU environmental regulation was written by the Brits. Most of it we want to retain. Some of it we might want to adjust, because there are bits of EU environmental legislation that, whilst well-intentioned, tend to push resources and activity into directions that aren't necessarily the most cost-effective use of those resources in terms of improving the environment. Example, the Water Framework Directive, which is a fantastic concept, but which does tend to drive some investment in some areas that where actually you'd rather have that investment going into areas that will deliver better environmental outcomes. Now, nobody is talking about a race to the bottom. It was very striking to me on day one, after the 23rd of June 2016. I never heard anybody in government suggest that this was an opportunity to make Britain the dirty man of Europe. And I don't think anybody, however they voted on the 23rd of June, voted for Britain to become the dirty man of Europe. So it has been clear in government, and Michael Gove has been explicit about this, that the point about Brexit from an environmental point of view is not just to maintain the high environmental standards that we have achieved through the European Union, but to build on those and enhance them. And, you know, I believe it, not just because, you know, I've looked him in the eye and heard him say it, but because I think most people in this country want it, and I think ultimately our politicians will do what the public want.
Great. Just one follow-up on that. Do you think that there needs to be this sort of replacement, if you like, for the European courts that would have the power to fine government ministries that didn't obey the rules in order to enforce it?
Yes, I do, and I think that is a really good example of government listening. We've been talking about listening tonight. So there was this debate, which many of you helped stimulate. After the UK leaves the European Union, the UK is no longer subject to infraction proceedings from the European Commission. We can no longer be taken to the European Court of Justice. Who is going to ensure that the government of the day sticks to its environmental commitments? That's a really good question. Governments tend to do dumb things. You know, I've worked for quite a lot of them. Often they do them by accident, but they do need to be held to account. And the initial response to that question, which, as I say, many of you posed rightly, and we posed privately from the government at the time, was that's not a problem. Brexit means Brexit. The government has changed its mind. Michael Gove has induced the government to change its mind, and Gove has proposed, and it will now happen, that there should be an independent environmental watchdog whose primary purpose is to hold the government of the day to account in relation to its environmental commitments, and which will probably have, as the Commission currently has, the power to fine governments if those governments don't do the right thing. Now, I think that is a good thing. I think that will strengthen environmental protection after we leave, which is a good example of something we've asked about. I also think it's a good example of politicians and governments being prepared to change their mind when confronted with really good arguments.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much. We've covered lots of ground today. Thank you very much to Sir James Bevan from the Environment Agency. Thanks to all of your great questions, and thank you to the RSA for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.